how the Singapore, for example, and Taiwan have had, you say, very free economies. Now, how do their economies remain free, but their politics and their human freedom is still curtailed, and as I understand, in many cases, rather severely curtailed? They don't have any of the freedoms we have: the press, religion.
Economic freedom is a necessary condition for all human freedom, but it's not a sufficient condition. You can have an economy that's largely free, with large elements of restrictions. For example, let me take the American experience. Before the Civil War, we had a mixture of a largely free economy with a segment of the population, the slaves, held in a condition of involuntary servitude. But even where you don't have complete political freedom, in the case of a Singapore or a Taiwan, human beings are much freer than they are in those societies where there is no economic freedom either. If you compare the conditions of people in a place like Singapore with the conditions of people in a place like Red China, or for that matter in Indonesia, you will see that the economic freedom is a very important component of total freedom. It's not something different, it's not something separate. Economic freedom is part of total freedom, and for most people it's the most important part. Freedom doesn't mean very much to a starving man. And if a free society could not help the starving man, it would be very difficult for it to remain free very long. That's why the ability of a free society to improve the lot of the ordinary person is a very, very necessary condition for its remaining free, but it's not the fundamental reason why I want a free society. I want a free society for the human and ethical and moral values that you stressed as appertaining to freedom. Freedom really rests, the value of freedom.
Yeah, but suppose the moral values mean a lot to me, but again, as I say, they mean nothing to the man who's hungry.
Absolutely
he hasn't had
not.
time to think. It means absolutely nothing to him. What are you going to do? Well, do you think it does mean something to him?
No. At first, I think it means something to many of them, of course. Many men have died for their moral values, have put those moral values much above life itself. But you and I, as citizens of a free society, will not stand the sight of people.
Yeah, let me put it a different way. Suppose you
starving.
you made a speech to all the people on welfare, and you said to them, look, freedom is much more important than the welfare money that you're getting. There are ethical concepts. There are spiritual things about things. Men have died for this thing. But you told them all that, and then said, and we're going to withdraw welfare now from it. What do you think would happen?
I would tell them something else. I would tell them.
I want to know also what you do.
I'll tell them both what I would do and what I would tell them. I would tell them, welfare has been corrupting you. Look at what it's doing to you. Look at what it's doing to your children. You would be far better off, in every respect.
But suppose he said to you, I don't see that at all. Without that welfare, we'd be in an awful mess.
You're wrong. You wouldn't be in an awful mess, but I understand your feeling, and I do not propose to withdraw assistance from you like that all at once. I think it would be intolerable to throw the millions of people who are now depending on welfare onto the streets. We've got to go gradually from here to there. That's why I've proposed a negative income tax as a transitional device, that it would enable us to give help to people who really need help, while not at the same time having the kind of mess we have now where most of the benefits go to people who are not. But look at the way in which the welfare system has been corrupting the very fabric of our society. We have put people in a trap which is of no part of their own making. I don't blame them. But they have been put in a trap where we are inducing them to become dependents, to become children, not to become independent human beings. The virtue and the desire of freedom is for what people can do with their freedom. Freedom is not an individual value, it's a social value. A Robinson Crusoe on an island, freedom is a meaningless concept to him.
Milton, how bad is the state of freedom in this country today?
It's a mixed bag. In some areas, we have more freedom than we've ever had before. In some other areas, our freedom has been drastically reduced. Our freedom to spend our own money as we want has been cut sharply. Our freedom to go into whatever occupation we want has been reduced sharply. Our freedom to enter various businesses has been reduced sharply. And these restrictions in our economic freedoms have carried over to restrictions on the freedom with which we speak and we talk, the activities we carry on, our attitudes toward governmental officials and all the rest. In those areas, our freedoms have been very seriously restricted.
What about you yourself? You as an individual, and we really have to deal with millions of, hundreds, 200 million, 220 million individuals. What about you? What freedoms do you think you've lost?
Well, I have been a very fortunate individual. That
sounds like a cop-out.
No, it's not a cop-out, because I want to add to it. I always said about the only people who have effective freedom of speech these days in the United States are tenured professors at private universities who are on the verge of retirement or have retired. And that's been my situation in these recent years. Consider the freedom of, for example, a professor of medicine at any one of our great institutions. He's almost certainly having his research financed by the federal government. Don't you suppose he'd think 2 or 3 times before he gave a lecture on the evils of socialized medicine? Or consider one of my colleagues at the university who happens to be getting grants of money from the National Science Foundation. Do you think he really feels free to speak out on the issue of whether government ought to be financing such research? Of course, you ought not to have freedom without costs, but the costs ought to be reasonable. They ought not to be disproportionate. There's no businessman in this country today who can speak out freely. Why is it that the businessmen today are so mealy-mouthed in what they say? There are very few of them who are willing to come out and say openly what they believe. Why?
About what?
About anything. Take, for example, the recent attempts by President Carter to impose voluntary wage and price controls. There's hardly a businessman in this country who doesn't think it's terrible. There are only about 2 or 3 businessmen who have had the courage to stand up and say something about that. But again, as I say, go to my academic colleagues. Many of them feel, as I do, that government is devoting altogether too much money, that there's been altogether too much subsidization of state universities and colleges all along the line, yet very few of them are willing to speak out.
Well, Milton, what about the generation that doesn't know what freedom is as you knew it, and therefore doesn't mind so much what has happened, just takes for granted what he's living under now?
I think that's a very real problem. I think we're living on our inheritance. We have inherited a philosophy and a set of attitudes, and they tend to be eroded. People get accustomed to what they know. There's an enormous tyranny of the status quo, and most people, most of the time, accept the circumstances that are around them. There's a natural human drive for freedom which always expresses itself, but it's stronger or weaker. And I think a great danger in continuing along the path that we've been going on is that we will lose still more of our inheritance, still more of our basic values, of our basic beliefs in freedom, and that we will have still less protest as more and more freedoms are taken away. The real value of freedom is that it provides diversity, and diversity is in turn the real protection of freedom. People who like to live in small cities can live in small cities. People who like the impersonality of a metropolis can live in a metropolis. We have loyalties to our churches. We have loyalties to our universities, to our schools, to our clubs, to our cities, to our states. It's this diversity, the fact that there isn't a monolithic conformity imposed on us, that is the source of protection for our freedom and also the fruit of freedom. It's because freedom protects diversity, allows. You will remember the phrase when Mao said he was going to allow 100 flowers to bloom. But of course he didn't. As soon as people spoke out and 100 flowers bloomed, he cut them off. But it's the blooming of many flowers, the fact that you have all of these different expressions of people's individuality, that produces the great achievements of civilization and that provides the great hope and protection of our freedom.
Are you saying then that there are pockets of freedom still existent in the countries?
As I said before, the picture is a mixed bag. In certain respects, we have more freedom than we have ever had. But in other respects, we have very much less freedom. Of course, there are great pockets of freedom. This is predominantly still a free country. We must not confuse the trend with the situation. We have been moving away from freedom. Our freedom is in jeopardy, but it by no means has been completely destroyed. And I believe that there is a strong enough component of freedom in our society that we will be able to preserve it, that we're going to turn this trend back, that we are going to cut government down to size, we're going to lay the groundwork for a resurgence, for a flowering of that diversity which has been the real product of our free society.